convinced the greatest fear of the human heart is not dying. The greatest fear of the human heart is dying alone. Because the spiritual dimension of death is the cutoff and isolation from the land of the living, which happens before you ever leave this life. Because you know as well as I do, when someone is gravely ill, watch children, they tend to spontaneous. It's like we don't know what that's about. We're afraid of it. Because we're in the presence of a mystery, we can't. And so sometimes we go the other way. But that the Christian courage that, as opposed to the Stoic courage, the Christian courage is exactly the courage that steps over that fear and bridges the isolation and addresses the dignity of the person. This is Jesus. All the great saints, from Shinjugan, who founded the Little Sisters of the Poor, for whom, what a saint, you should read her life. She was already in her 30s in France, you know, and I'm sorry, in the 19th century in France, they didn't take care of their elderly very well. Elderly women who were destitute, who had no family, were left on the streets to die. Destitute. There was no institution to take care of them. They were just left there. And tuberculosis was a tremendous disease in those days, a disease incurable, so they would either die of starvation or they would die of the disease quicker in the coldness of a French winter morning. And she, a good Christian woman who was a deeply prayerful woman, she saw and she responded. So she founded the Order of the Little Sisters of the Poor precisely because she saw an elderly woman dying on the road because she had been abandoned, had no one, no family, and she picked her up and she took her to her apartment and she put her in her bed and she slept on the floor and she took care of her till she died. Because that's not only what a Christian does, that's what a human being does in the face of the suffering of another human being. But you could say the same about many, many of the saints, Francis of Assisi, but Teresa of Calcutta. What's the whole point there except that you extend the compassionate care by lifting up and taking to yourself the other ones. We do this because despite the fact that we know that in the end we cannot stop physical death from happening. I mean, we can cure diseases, we can do many good things to alleviate pain, and many diseases don't have to be sicknesses unto death. But in the end, we accompany each other, and people like Saint Jean-Julien from France, or Teresa of Calcutta, St. Francis of Assisi, the founders of many of the early hospital orders and so forth. It's all born in that cultural human recognition that the proper response to the suffering of another is an extension and a compassion and a reaching out. Now, as I move to my third and final section, it is certainly incumbent upon us as a Christian people to remain extremely close to the scriptural message about the meaning of suffering, the word of the cross for ourselves, but also it is absolutely essential and indispensable that we consistently hear the Lord Jesus through the parable of the Good Samaritan and many other ways, and the examples of the great saints of Christian charity and of Christian service to the sick and to the suffering, that we hear in that our responsibility as a Christian people to be true to our own vocation. The world may fall off a cliff in the euthanasia movement, but we cannot. Which means we must do what we can and what is in our power to care for our sick and accompany them in the dignity of their condition as human beings who are passing not just into death, but death into life. It is a shepherding. And by doing so, God grants to us a grace to ennoble our own human dignity, because it is to be a human who shirks in the face of the call to be compassionate is to become less human. And is also to disrespect the dignity of the one who suffers. So to suffer, whenever the chance to follow the example of the Good Samaritan is dismissed or is ignored in the Christian conscience, wherever it happens, whenever that happens, two are diminished: the one who suffers and the one who could have helped. Because the gospel standard is such as it's not enough to say, I didn't see. And Jesus says, whatsoever you did to the least of mine, you did to me. And that is irrevocable in the Christian community. But let us be frank. That we are no longer on the cusp of a society that no longer seeks to look at the world through these kinds of eyes, but that we are right in the middle of it. Intellectually, at the root of the Christian appreciation for the call that suffering places upon me as an individual and as a member of human society to respond with compassion, philosophically, intellectually, theologically, there are two very simple principles. That it is, and these are principles that Plato and Aristotle articulated, and St. Paul and St. Augustine and St. Thomas recognized as absolutely true to the human truth, and in keeping with the spirit of the gospel. The first principle is, it is never permitted to do evil for the sake of the good. That's a human principle of moral law. It is never permitted to do evil for the sake of the good, or a perceived good. And secondly, also philosophically, intellectually, theologically, at the root of the Christian dispensation with regard to our response to the suffering of another, that the deliberate taking of an innocent life is never acceptable. That's intrinsically evil. Two very important principles. I'll repeat them again. It is never permitted to do evil for the sake of the good. And secondly, the taking of an innocent life is always intrinsically evil. The deliberate taking. I would argue that these are philosophical principles which are true because we're human, not because I'm a Christian and you're not a Christian. It's just simply that's true because that's the high point of human moral discourse from the ancient world to the modern world. Because it holds society together. Because you break it, you lose either one of those principles. That is never permitted to do evil for the sake of the good, and you sooner or later you end up with what Benedict XVI has very astutely called the tyranny of the powerful. If the powerful can do anything and cannot be held back by a moral good that is and moral law that is bigger than they are, if nothing holds them in check, then society is at the mercy of their power. They become like gods. There are too many horrendous examples in the history of the 20th century of the tyranny of the powerful, for whom the moral principle it is never intended to do, it is never permitted to do evil for the sake of a good, meant nothing. And for whom the principle is never proper and never acceptable because it is intrinsically evil to take an innocent life. If those principles do not form the bedrock of human society, then human society devours itself. That's not simply a Christian proposition, it's a human proposition of sound philosophical thinking. And if you think philosophical thinking isn't important, take those two principles away, what do you have? The blood of the 20th century. I'm convinced that Plato and Aristotle would be horrified by what passes as human thinking nowadays. Dispense of those principles and you've lost the bedrock of what makes human living in a community, in a society, of many religions and many people possible, because these two principles sustain mutual respect. I can never do something evil to you because I think it's good for me. And I can never, on my own in any way, disrespect the innocence of your life. And take it, no matter how powerful I am, no matter how many armies I have, no matter how many goods I think can be accomplished if we could just get rid of those people, or that problem, by this means. And these principles, which are also the basis for basic formation, basic principles by which Christian moral discourse continues in our time,